We've been running the studio since 2001, and I've put together a few projects to try and show the range of projects that we work on and how we like to approach projects, which I've called this Selection Architecture's Conversation because the process that we go through is more important to us in a way than the final product, although of course we hope the final built realisation is of good quality. To introduce the studio, we started out as a really young practice. You're all about to go off and find jobs, and as a young practice we were doing house extensions, quite modest projects, and had the ambition to work in the public sector, and we were very fortunate with the beginning of a Labour government investing very heavily in education, and so our early projects were won in competition through relatively small programmes when these were all new early years programmes, and this was a nursery at John Perry School. We began to be interested in experimenting with slightly new form, but using one singular materials that could be used in different ways, and this was a Sure Start Centre in Colchester. And then back in London, embarking in Dagenham in a much more urban site, looking at how we could almost try to descale what is a very small building and make it appear to resonate with, potentially the tower blocks. Which one of these is a pointer? I can't remember, but there. The sort of context of the tower blocks, we try to make what is a small children's building resonate with that context. And as mentioned, that kind of grew to working with the biggest education project was that actually in Guildford it was a campus for a special needs school and a secondary school together, which was a huge project. And the interesting thing for us was that this was both about education, but more importantly a dialogue about the context, because what became important to us in this project was the fact that this route which we opened up, we opened up a public route through the two buildings to reconnect a community that had been broken by this imposition of what was a previous school that was to be knocked down and replaced. The reason it was being demolished is because it had been attacked by arson 3 times in the last 2 years, basically because everybody wanted to break through the site. So the sort of planning and regulations that had made this school happen seemed to be at odds with what the community wanted, how people would use the site. And given the programming for the school was about opening its doors to bring people in, it seemed to us that opening up this connection and trying to invite a dialogue between both the two buildings but also the route between them was particularly important. And within that then there were obviously sort of narratives that we really enjoyed about how we could take the scale of what were really substantial buildings, this is the special needs school, and begin to sort of play with the materiality of it. So it was a very kind of robust brick language that we used across both buildings, but where the special needs school had its enormous canopy that kind of flew out over the building, we enjoyed this sort of narrative of trying to make an undulating roof, which was both a sort of lyrical journey through the building, so that when a lot of the children move horizontally on beds, they're staring up at the ceiling, that this building would unfold through them. But it also created a sort of domestic characteristic in these sort of outdoor spaces, which had almost the kind of motif of a residential characteristic. And this idea of using a material, this is again is a very early project, but the sort of trying to work with a material which has some resonance then with its site. This was a small project that we were commissioned to design 2 pavilions in a park in London next to Tower Bridge, in the context of more London. So this is the land of Norman Foster, glass and steel, huge buildings. And we're friends with Spencer and de Grey and Norman Foster. We were slightly shocked when we then presented this burnt timber pavilion that we felt was an appropriate response to that. For us, this was about trying to bring more resonance of the nature and the setting of the site, but also it kind of grew out of the fact that this was a huge bomb site. So the narratives that had unfolded to us when we started looking at the site were through conversations with, for instance, the taxi driver that took us there that had played on the bomb sites when he was young. So there was inherently this idea of danger. You were looking at the Tower of London where prisoners were kind of held, and this was something we wanted to kind of evoke through a kind of material response in generating the design of the building. And as well as that, as a studio, what we really like is the kind of characteristics you have when you're in a faculty like this, between product design, architecture. The idea of making is really important. and testing. So in our studio, we have always worked in studios with outdoor yard space, where this was before burnt timber was reignited as a popular thing in the UK. But it's an ancient Japanese technique. But if you go to Trada and ask, or at the time, if you went to Trada and asked for advice about how you could use burnt timber, charred timber, there was no advice that could get given. You couldn't get any warranties. So basically, as an architect, you had to prove it yourself. So we had to sit out in the yard with a clock and time the 2-minute intervals how much the timber would char, how much you then hose it down. So we had to do our own testing to try and make that project happen. And that sort of process between trying to work within planning, within narratives of communities, and within this sort of the reality of making is something that is reflected upon in our studio quite a lot. Deborah actually did a PhD as part of the sort of research in practice, where we looked back over all of the projects that we'd kind of worked on to try and explore sort of themes and narratives which implicitly were things we were interested, which explained why we might be introducing things, why a green wall was introduced into a building which was another early Shore Start building, but it was building in a park, so it was actually about how you could come up with an argument to justify building on green space by bringing in more visual greenery or nature into a setting. And so a series of what we described as orbits of influence that became our kind of internal way of briefing ourselves, a sort of checklist of factors that we thought were interesting and important about what made a successful project in our studio, and also about opening a dialogue with people that work with us, so that there's a shared narrative that we can enter into, and everyone kind of can share this sort of common language as a way of approach. And there were basically 4 kind of considerations. You can see, I'm not going to talk then, I'm now going to be testing myself about whether this is evident in the projects afterwards. But so the first one was about materiality, as I've just mentioned, this kind of social characteristics of a project, about how it works with not just the client, but the kind of wider community or the city that it's for. A sense of engaging with landscape, which for our interpretation of landscape, that's about moments of social interaction. It's not about saying it just is about nature and greenness, but it's about saying an informality of how a project is situated within its wider setting. People should be able to move through it and find encounters in unpredictable ways. And also an idea of something which is slightly awkward. So this was the most interesting thing for us that came out of maybe this sort of reflection, was that we liked the sense of unease that you would get in looking at a project, that it shouldn't be straightforward. There should be something which challenges you or asks you to question why you're, how does that building stand up? Or, what makes something happen? Or why I can see something that is kind of beyond what I'm expecting to see. And this also, part of that research, this is a great PhD program to do, but part of that research also draws in, you have to get a number of journalists or commentators to also reflect on your work. And so some of these observations were also coming through from narratives that other people were saying. So the image I showed earlier of Pond Meadow School was just where this sort of, if you're going to use brickwork, it's quite odd when you reflect on it to have brickwork which is flying without any evident support. I mean, why would you do that? Because that's you have to bond brickwork onto concrete. It's not a kind of a sensible thing to do in many ways. But for us, it was about establishing a dialogue about how you could literally just peel away this layer of a structure and reveal something unusual. So everybody in architecture hates the word, it's a terrifying word to use, beauty, but this question sort of came out about how can you use the word beauty, what do you find beautiful? It's a personal opinion about what this means, and it's a sort of an ugly word in architecture to talk about something which is beauty. And is this beautiful? Many people told us they thought this was a really ugly building. It was one of our first built projects. And for us, it was all about this sort of strangeness of this huge canopy that is quite hard when you go around that building to work out how on earth that's supported from an inherently translucent building. And through that process, the sort of narratives did sort of venture into trying to draw parallels between how artists work, how they present their work. And we loved this kind of dialogue with Ed Ruscha. that somebody threw in front of us about this sort of condition of how you do just take something very ordinary but try to turn it into something extreme. In this instance, maybe that's a sort of the coincidence of different perspectives coming together to draw a different level of focus. But most interesting was this art piece that we didn't know about beforehand, but we find this like really beautiful piece of writing. You see this badly done on purpose, but the badly done on purpose thing was done so well that it just becomes, let's say, profound. This slight kind of like misalignment of the text. Now, in architecture, again, that's a really dangerous thing to say, isn't it? We're not going to, do we really want to say to any new client, well, actually our buildings are really badly made. That's what we're really proud of, and that's why you should appoint us. But the thing that it does is that slight distortion, there's something which isn't quite as you expect it, opens up a conversation. It means people can engage with things, and I think that's where we really became interested. And so this idea in terms of looking at a project was about what makes you slow down, what causes you to look at something a second time. You shouldn't just walk past a building. If you're going to invest years of your life kind of making something, then people should damn well want to look at it or engage with it. So I'm going to show a couple of projects, the first one of which is a really ordinary building. It's called Corner House. It was finished last year, and it's for a developer in London called Derwent, who are, again, a brilliant client who really care about quality. This is in Fitzrovia, and seemingly it's a very straightforward brick building which fits very neatly into its context. And we would describe this as a project which is just timeless. That was our ambitions. We wanted something which was beautiful, fitted into its context without question. The context is this: it's a residential and commercial area in London. The buildings varying in scale, very traditional, usually with commercial use at ground floor, and quite straightforward window apertures, small frontages based on land ownership, elegant bit of London, quite ordinary still, as I said, and that was the site. So it was this rather a sort of unassuming, but also it was awkward in itself. This kind of very period piece of an office building, which was part of the economics of London, huge amount of investment about introducing new residential projects. That was our brief. And the way we approach that is that typically, so one of the rules that we have sort of established as a way of working is very, very straightforward but quite precise analysis that we automatically do on every project to understand scale and rhythm of a project, of a context that we're working in. A series of drawings that we work through about looking at apertures, scale, rhythm. This is just literally editing down the kind of the context to these proportions so that we can understand how those might establish a set of rules based on the proportions and hierarchy that you would have in a context. But if that's the photograph that we might be referring to, by beginning to sort of abstract it, it gives us a freedom to kind of reinvent those rules, but still have a order and hierarchy that we can work with. So within that project, it became a kind of play of composition based on those horizons, those narrative or scale relationships from the street, but also how this was called Corner House because it was a building which sat on two corners. It turned twice and had different relationships between the main street, a side street, and a mews. And very much, the building was kind of ordered in parts about balancing affordable units, commercial units at ground floor level, straightforward accommodation, hidden or held within this brick skin, and then crowned with these two pavilions which were generated from a study of rights of light and how we could actually increase modestly the volume of the building. So moving around in terms of the sort of scale, you can see the introduction of two materials. We worked with one brick source but two finishes to this brickwork so that it would immediately begin to introduce a divide of materiality as you moved from the main street onto the smaller back streets which needed more light coming into them. And then looking at the kind of detail of how this came together, we were really interested in the idea of how you could use brickwork to articulate surface and detail that might otherwise be created on a lot of the reference projects that we were looking at through different levels of ornamentation and craft. This is working with one material to look at the depth of brickwork that we could introduce, but also have this element of surprise to it that's discovered. You can't really see this from the street, but the fifth elevation of this building is the fact that within a much more urban context, obviously the roof is as important to a huge audience as the kind of levels from the ground. So the building plans are really straightforward. You move up through a series of apartments which are kind of stacked up until you get to the sort of fourth floor, where we were able to sort of introduce what is a kind of relatively straightforward starting point of living room and bedrooms, which then moves through into this sort of a journey where you come through into this strange kitchen with its own terrace, which is buried beneath one of these pavilions here. And then you carry on up a staircase into this other kind of worldly, what's now become a bedroom, but it was a sort of second study originally. Whoops, I've just pressed the wrong button. And so the section, which starts off as a very ordinary building, has this kind of crystalline crown to it, which doesn't appear from the street, but reveals the kind of life or narrative of the building as you move through it. What was particularly interesting also for us was going back to this idea of making the building, was that we were told by our engineers that, you know, this was going to be a huge concrete frame and blah, blah, blah. And we were like, but we're working with brick. So if we're working with brick, we want the brick to be load bearing. And the engineers were like, absolutely, you just can't do it. It's much more efficient. You're going to build it out of concrete, you know, and that's it. So it does have in the end, we were able to get the engineers to do some more work, and they proved that if you did make this brickwork skin load-bearing in itself, it was going to reduce the amount of concrete structure to support the main part of the building so much. The piles went down, the speed of the construction went down, and the cost went down. So the wall depth got thicker, which is what we wanted anyway, but in compensation they could balance this up. So we went back to this idea of actually using bricks as they were supposed to do. So it got this huge efficiency from the structure by just really pushing the idea of how to work with the material itself. And the proportions then that I was showing from those early images, it's a really efficient building. Every floor level has the same floor to ceiling height, but we still wanted to establish this idea that responded to the scale of the sort of piano nobile at ground floor. And you see basically within this, each floor has a very slightly different relationship between the window aperture and its frame within the opening, so that you get a sense of different proportions, even though the building itself doesn't have that difference internally. The enjoyment of trying to work with those materials was a huge amount of kind of testing of different finishes, and also, you know, the mock-up of going to actually work with the manufacturers about testing those details, because all of the reveals to this were obviously critical about trying to minimise the number of special bricks that we had to work with, but to get the right amount of depth and shadow on that. So there were lots of rainy day trips to actually see how this could be materialised. And that as you move up through the building, you begin to just pick up on the top level, this sort of where you can't see these pavilions, but the order of the glazing just shifts on the top floor, which was the fourth floor where the kind of crystalline apartment begins. And as you move up, you begin to see the ventilation detail in the side of the windows, which had been picked up previously. Lower down, you can see the same motif is used in the balustrading on the first floor. And then as you see the building, and when you step back, you begin to see the fact that there is actually a shift at the top floor. All the windows are indented so that you get these different angular reflections which anticipate the change that you get to the roof, and also have much more contemporary scale to those windows at the top of the building, where these pavilions then take over and create this whole landscape of kind of connected terraces of sort of playing on the top of this building. So then the introduction of a whole series of green roofs to that creates this kind of green garden in the city, which is a narrative now that has completely sort of changed what was otherwise. All of the plant, for instance, is contained within those volumes as well, so that there's a sort of delight that's brought into this kind of garden and residential setting as the building turns into those quiet streets. At the end of the day, we hope, the building sits as a kind of, again, very quiet building, but when you go past it, to instance, we do get lots of people coming up to us telling us how much what they've noticed or what they like about the building, which is great as an architect to have kind of feedback from people as you go through. Internally, the building's like really straightforward. So for, this was a speculative residential project, so it has a very simple language. But then this idea of views and connections were very important to us. So the sort of public character of the building was followed through in all of the apartments, with these reeded glass doors into all the living room spaces, so that there's a connectivity of sort of ceremony as you go through the building. And the generosity of the windows was really about framing this relationship between the kind of ordinary setting. We would frame kind of views of these kind of what we thought were rather wonderful kind of courtyards. The ordinary being brought into this was something which was, this is the city, it's the context we're working in, and it's something we like. And again, in dialogue with these very strange geometries that are kind of crowned. So this was the kitchen on the top, on the 5th floor. You get these kind of extraordinary moments alongside that. So playing that kind of dialogue is a way to really enjoy the kind of narrative between ordinary and extraordinary on the street that otherwise perhaps people just pass by, and that's fine too. Just jumping a scale was then a series of projects which were about making literally. We're very lucky to have a couple. It was mentioned that we've worked with Edmund de Waal, this amazing ceramic artist, on a couple of projects. We also have just finished a second project with this brilliant jeweller called Alex Monroe. And Alex used to share studio space in the yard that we were based in before we moved to our current studio. And he is a jeweller, so he works in very kind of tiny way, but he's prolifically successful and has a business, an international business now, made possible by the web, by the internet. It's a huge amount of trade electronically, also a big market in Japan. But he found this tiny little shop unit in Southwark. I'm pointing this at my laptop here instead of the thing. It's a tiny little studio which he wanted to turn into a little workshop. It's in the shadow of the Shard. And the narrative of this is literally each floor is big enough to have like 3 people in it. So it's a tiny shop front, but we worked on this kind of way with him of the process with which he makes his work. This is about a conversation with Alex on his, what he does during a day is that there's a shop where people come and ring a doorbell because they want a wedding ring made. So it's a very intimate setting. There's a studio on the floor above that where he might work with 2 assistants in terms of making it. There's a production floor above where 3 other people might be testing that and developing it more. And also in the workshop there might be some assembly. And then he has a meeting room which is all about taking these one-off clients and journalists up, and they have tea. He can then go up out from that up onto a roof terrace on the top. And in the basement is a dispatch area, because a lot of this is now about assembling components. So we worked out the sort of narrative with him of how the order of this building could work. And then it was this kind of a really brilliant conversation with him about the kind of craft of the building. Alex is very English, and so he serves English tea in China. And the sort of conversation he had was about, he works with metal. He wanted this building to be wrapped in metal, like a metal casket for his, like a jewellery box. But he spoke about tailoring and the sort of precision of putting together a suit. And so it was to be like English tailoring for his workshop. In terms of making it, it was a really difficult site to work on. And so we worked with CLT. We knew this had to be built really quickly. So it was a prefabricated structure that came in 3 days, just in components. You're probably all aware of CLT structures. It took a lot longer to put the cladding on it, it's got to be said. But the whole building went up incredibly quickly. And it's a sort of distorted form that just begins to kind of turn the corners so that it shifts the geometry, but opens up a kind of language with the Tower of Guys, and turns the sort of end of this block, which has subsequently been changed again by another huge development next door, sort of anticipated those changes. But this just perches above the little shop front with its kind of restored awning, so that on the one level at ground, as you walk past, you don't kind of notice this. As you step back, you begin to see this building just opening views and relationships in a slightly different way. And the building starts to peel back. So from his studio at the top, he gets a kind of little outdoor space that he goes out onto, which again opens up a new dialogue with the street before going up to the roof terrace where the people working in the building can sort of share a social space. And this was really a narrative then about working. It's a zinc-clad building. You can see kind of the lines running through here, which are a narrative which was picked up by the kind of contextual studies we had. So it's using one material and one motif, but picking up these very subtle lines which respond to the analysis which we'd carried out. So in terms of having a conversation with the planners wanted us originally to rebuild this as a masonry building to complete the terrace, to match the adjoining building. But by explaining this, we were able to really bring them on board with a building which is very, very different. And the skin begins to just peel back over some of the windows. And we worked really closely. This is all made on site, formed on site with the zinc workers. So for us, it was about understanding then the tolerances that we had to work with. And actually, when you get up close to it, it does have, you can see it sort of folded and cut profile. And that idea of actually, when you're close to the building, it's not perfect. You can see imperfection in it is something which we really enjoy, or through the conversation with Alex, was really enjoyed about the fact that you can see this building has been very made. When it comes up, it meets the existing brickwork, and you have this difference of texture which informs the exterior and similarly internally. So where we built up against the flank wall, it's just sealed and painted. So you have this sort of rawness of the CLT on the right-hand side here, which is the structure running up all the way. That's how the building's held up. You go past that with the existing brick wall on the right-hand side. And the staircase became this really social narrative to tie this building together. So Alex began to inhabit that, always intended to inhabit it, with the sort of inspiration of things that inform his collections. And here you see the sort of scale of those workspaces. So the CLT, the timber, which is the exposed finish internally, is also cut to make the workbenches. The workbenches, this is a traditional jeweller's work base. I've forgotten the name now, but you have a semicircular cutout with a leather sack that kind of ties in to catch all of the filings from the metalwork. And then the half-circular cutouts are actually used to make the stools to sit on as well. So the building sits like really comfortably, and we were really lucky to be able to take that conversation forward, because the success of him building a business in the city of craft and making, which is something to really celebrate, I think, at the moment in terms of the sort of investment in crafts in the city, is he's now been able to, he was able to commission us to build a second project for him, which is on Tower Bridge Road. So this is just finished, and this is specifically a workshop. It sits in a similar context, a slightly larger scale street, but sandwiched between these two little buildings was an old accountancy firm, and we managed to, we wanted to carry on this conversation with him about this sort of metal skins and these almost Japanese tower buildings. It's very small in footprint. This one's much deeper, and this opens up a sort of narrative of how this building can just begin to appear slightly more three-dimensionally. So you see the sort of screen of intervention which runs up the street, and then as the building begins to poke up on the quieter residential streets, you get the same language coming round. And this was a similar dialogue. That the building had a design studio on the top of it, and was wanting to present this idea that there's a dialogue between the kind of main commercial street, but also this creativity which kind of peaks up above the kind of residential characteristic. And this is the kind of view from the rear, where an element of that cladding of the Core 10 screen just wraps over the kind of design studio windows at the top. And this was about creating a sort of filigree elevation. It started with a conversation about security, that this workshop has a lot of precious materials in it. It's very valuable. When he bought the building, it was squatted twice in the 6 months that we had to actually get started on site. And so inherently there was a concern about security. So the idea of taking what was going to, we didn't want to have this building closed down with a roller shutter every night and at the weekends. So the idea was, could we make the whole building almost derived from the characteristics of the roller shutter, but then take this and begin to fold it structurally, so that you see here, this is the profile of actually taking the kind of cornicing and building this out as a kind of three-dimensional, almost 3D printed, or when you make a really beautiful laser cut model, you can just kind of have this sort of stacked profiling where you begin to read the same material stepping out to form an almost exaggerated cornices and profiles, which then respond to the context of the horizons of shop fronts next door. So it picks up that dialogue but completely reinterprets it. And very simple plans. Here you see the same sort of very deep plans, the same scale of the jeweller's workbench sitting at the back, which has a light well at the back of it. So here the building has a very deep ground floor plan. We were able to gain an extra floor on the top for his studio, and this becomes a similar opening up of a workshop space coming through into a social space, which is a kitchen coming out onto a terrace, with then photography studio and web-based activity and a design studio on the top. We became interested, I guess, at this stage as well about, for our, Alex's business is really successful through the kind of virtual world, and all architects are aware that their website is our public front door. And so we're also introducing into the studio a way of trying to draw consistently how these elements come together. Anyway, there's a movie of how these drawings are made as little animations, so that you can begin to kind of get the narrative of the components coming together. So this is about the staircase rising up through the building, and then each of the floors and how they're connected together. So the idea of a sort of making drawings part of the process of both design but also how you communicate those ideas has become very important in the studio. Internally, again, this building, one material internally, everything's lined with ply. It's ply with this metalwork stair, which is just folded up through this 3 stories of an atrium at the beginning, so it connects the narrative of the building together. And then very, very cheap, simple metal shelving to fill the gaps. And in this way, I think we like to try and have this conversation about starting a project which contributes something beyond what the client asks for ourselves. And we refer to this as saying the city is our client, particularly if we're working with a commercial client. We like to say, this has to do something more. And another big component of work in our studio is on a very urban level. We teach, and so we sort of try to draw these kind of conversations together through what we'd like to say is a cultural landscape of how we enjoy the city. We all like making connections. We worked right opposite our studio are these two, it's actually Vauxhall Spring Gardens. There's this huge park. Historically, it was the Pleasure Gardens. And so we've worked with Lambeth for a framework for how this public space is used in a different way. The greatest thing for us is discovering that it's a Pokemon stop. So it's now a sort of the way you actually connect public spaces together and move through the city, and using or being aware of at least what technology people use, is that this as an architect, we can be as highbrow as we like, but basically, that's how people understand Vauxhall Spring Gardens. You go on you get whatever points it is that my son enjoys. And so we really like to try and acknowledge, who's using the city, the spaces around the buildings that we are working on, and refer to one of the basic things we always use is geotagging technology as well, to understand. This is a Flickr map of the city. I don't know if some of you might be aware of these, where I think it's the red dots are basically tourist photographs which are tagged on the web. Blue is photographs taken by local people. Yellow is where it's indeterminate, it can't be established, based on the duration of people have in the city from their mobile phones. So this technology allows us to understand how people are moving through the city and using different public spaces. So does Airbnb. Airbnb have these networks of how they're connecting parts of the city together. This was from Berlin and the journeys they're going between different Airbnb settings. But I don't know if you're aware of how that technology is now changing how we use the city. There's this brilliant or slightly sinister person called Georgia, who you can pay through Airbnb, who will guide you through London. So when you come to London for a few days, you can pay her and she'll be your host to give you a series of opportunities to go to an auction house and see how that works. You can rub shoulders with a VIP she'll get you into a private gallery opening or has some surprise event for £180 extra. So you can get this insider's kind of guided trip through the city by paying somebody money, which you do through your phone, and we have no idea who Georgia is. We haven't actually paid her to test that, which we probably should. But we love this idea that you should be able to, if you've got these devices, the city should be popular. We should be engaging with those things. And this sets up a series of sort of design actions that we would like to sort of promote in how we look at public realm projects. I was going to end very quickly, just in terms of that sort of scale. This is a project which it's urban scale projects which we work on range in scale from the project like at Vauxhall, which is a small project for local authority. This is for Camden. It had been it's a 15-year-old project which was looking at Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street, these two conduits into central London where you arrive at Centrepoint, and for those of you who know that sort of landmark building. So it's a huge area. The blue building in the middle, you can see the British Museum. So it's an area where hundreds of tourists go based on our, so when we looked at our Flickr maps and stuff, we see this as kind of everyone should know where they are. Loads of people are lost. This was what the streets were like. It was full of really it's not like this now, but really heavy traffic conduits. It's a one-way gyratory, so complete chaos where cyclists competing with trucks, no real emphasis on public realm, and going back to the sort of individual, to kind of make this happen, you have to go and stand in the middle of the road, stop the traffic, to take the photograph, to see what these kind of views and connections might be if this isn't dominated by traffic anymore. We're not allowed. We can only do that ourselves, I guess, because as employers, you're not allowed to send have anyone that works for you put them in danger. But we can do it ourselves. The brief was to transform this area, put two-way traffic back on the streets, get rid of the one-way gyratory, and reduce car and vehicle use enormously. The only way it was possible, after 15 years of Camden trying to do that, was the accidental result of Crossrail. Crossrail at Tottenham Court Road, major construction site, had disrupted traffic movement so much that it had proved that the streets and that part of the city could still exist with a vast reduction in vehicular movement. So suddenly this brief became real. And so we were then asked to kind of take this on board. So going back to our sort of popular way of looking at it, the other aspect, Primark had just opened. That was the opening scene at Primark at Tottenham Court Road. Really ordinary desire for kind of people to use the kind of city is really important. We recorded the fact that everybody was lost when we went there. So even though it's a major part of the city, finding a way to the British Museum was not something people found easy. So we have what we say 100 journeys. Before we even start a project, we just go and find 100 people that are moving through a site and ask why they're there, what they're aiming to do, and it reveals this whole set of sort of desires, both ordinary and extraordinary, which can help inform how we would approach it. And so just generally, these are just almost before and after. The project's just starting now on site. This was an idea, this was before, this was leaving London, Centrepoint, this fantastic building, which is, we think a sort of a locator, it's a sort of somewhere you can really orientate yourself from in London. At the moment, it's almost like it's only when you leave. You never looked at it, because you never arrived that way. It was a one-way route out of London through very, very busy streets. So what's happening is this is now two-way traffic. It's taxis and buses only on Tottenham Court Road coming out of the city. So it's completely transformed as a sort of pedestrian, cyclist environment. It's promoting the whole, this is a region of the city which is based on creativity and furniture making. So it's allowing huge investment in that kind of characteristic. And what was a commercial street on Tottenham Court Road is balanced by all of the side streets. So we've been able to make 5 new public spaces. This is what was basically a car park quite often unused, this is in a residential context, so this is going to become this amazing new green space. And there are 5 of these different spaces, each having different characteristics based on how they're used and who's moving through them. So there's a cancer hospital which will now have a green space outside it instead of having a highway. And this is Prince's Circus, which at the moment again is a really confusing geometry of streets just off Shaftesbury Avenue, which is now going to become a sort of 24-hour space. Traffic still can move through here, but it becomes a much harder surface. So it's not about just introducing greenness everywhere. This is about creating a kind of durable landscape which has, you can just about sort of trace through here, but it has sustainable drainage so that when it rains there are indentations here so the water will collect in some areas of the surface. And it's also a 24-hour space. It's designed that this is used, really popular at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night after people have come out of the theatre. So this becomes a sort of landscape that will change throughout the day and night, so that what we hope is that both in terms of buildings and in terms of public realm, there's a way that you can, or we can, contribute to democratising public space, making it accessible to much wider audiences and respond to the different conditions that we all engage in today, as well as a sort of historical context. So that's where I was going to end today. Thanks.